The quiet of the Saturday morning was a fraud. Ezra Whitlock sensed it the moment he stepped from the cool, conditioned air of his farmhouse onto the sun-drenched porch. It wasn't a sound, but a stillness, the wrong kind of stillness, the kind that precedes an unwelcome discovery. He held a mug of coffee, its steam mingling with the scent of damp earth and distant alfalfa, a fragrance that had defined his family's existence on this land for 4 generations. His gaze swept over the 40-acre spread, a patchwork of heritage tomato fields, heirloom corn, and pasture where a small herd of Angus cattle grazed peacefully. This land was his anchor, the physical manifestation of a legacy he fought to honor while navigating the treacherous currents of his other life in Washington, D.C. Then he saw it, a splash of unnatural color near the old property line, where his grandfather's oak trees stood sentinel between the farm and the manicured lawns of the Millbrook Falls estates. A man in a fluorescent yellow vest was methodically pounding a wooden stake, topped with a strip of pink ribbon, into the ground. Another stake stood 10 feet away, and a third lay on the grass beside him. Ezra felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The stakes weren't on the property line. They were a good 20 feet inside it, carving a straight, deliberate path through the buffer of wild grasses and ancient trees he maintained for organic certification. He set his mug down on the porch railing with a deliberate click and walked, not ran, toward the man. His stride was long and measured, the walk of a man accustomed to traversing his own land. He had spent the week in grueling congressional hearings, debating multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bills, and had flown home late last night for a weekend of respite. A weekend to trade his suit for boots and reconnect with something real. It seemed reality had followed him home. The surveyor, a young man with a sunburned neck and an air of professional detachment, looked up as Ezra approached. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. "Morning," the surveyor said, his voice neutral. "Good morning," Ezra replied, his tone equally level, betraying none of the cold fury coiling inside him. "Can I help you with something?" "Just doing a survey for the Millbrook Falls HOA, marking out a common area boundary." The young man gestured with his thumb toward the line of stakes. Ezra stopped a few feet away, planting his boots firmly in the soil his great-grandfather had first tilled. He looked from the pink-tipped stake to the surveyor's face, then back to the stake. "There must be a mistake," he said, the words precise and calm. "This is my property. The common area ends at that line of oaks." The surveyor shrugged, an almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders. He seemed uncomfortable. A pawn in a game he didn't understand. "My work order just says to mark a 20-foot easement, starting from the pins on the northeast corner. Says here it's for a utility and access corridor project." He pulled a folded paper from his back pocket. A work order from Pinnacle Management Group, the company that ran the HOA. "There is no 20-foot easement here," Ezra stated. It wasn't a question. He knew every inch of this land, every legal line and historical covenant. His family's deed was as familiar to him as a chapter in a beloved book. The surveyor avoided his eyes, focusing instead on aligning his transit. "Look, sir, I just plant the stakes where the map tells me to. If you have a dispute, you'll need to take it up with the management company or the HOA board." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a business card for Pinnacle, holding it out. The gesture was meant to be helpful, but it felt like a dismissal, a bureaucratic redirection that was both infuriating and, to Ezra, humiliatingly familiar. He was being handled. Ezra didn't take the card. He let the silence hang in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, fetching newspapers from their driveways, or walking their dogs along the pristine sidewalks. He could feel their eyes on him, Their curiosity piqued by the sight of the U.S. Secretary of Transportation in a quiet standoff with a surveyor on a Saturday morning. The fluorescent vest was a beacon, drawing attention to a conflict he hadn't even known had begun. "Tell your employer," Ezra said, his voice dropping to a low, controlled register, "that they are marking private property. Tell them to remove these stakes by the end of the day." The surveyor finally met his gaze, and, for a moment, Ezra saw a flicker of genuine apology. "I'll pass it along, sir," he said, "but my orders are to finish the line." He turned back to his work, lifted his mallet, and with a series of dull, resonant thuds, drove another stake into the earth that belonged to Ezra Whitlock. Each strike was a declaration, a quiet, procedural act of war. Ezra stood for another minute, watching the pink ribbon flutter in the gentle breeze, a gash of artificial color against the deep greens and browns of his heritage. He then turned and walked back to the house, the cold knot in his stomach now a block of ice. The fight had come to him, not with a roar, but with the polite, implacable tap-tap-tap of a hammer on wood. Inside, the scent of Delilah's cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the acrid taste of conflict in Ezra's mouth. His wife stood at the counter, dusting flour from her hands, her brow furrowed with concern. She had seen the whole exchange from the window. "What was that about?" Delilah asked, her voice a calm center in his rising storm. "The HOA is claiming a 20-foot easement on our land. Sent a surveyor to mark it out." Delilah's hands stilled. A 20-foot easement. For what, there's nothing in the CC&Rs about that. Apparently, it's for a utility and access corridor. Ezra walked into his study, a room lined with books on agricultural science, transportation policy, and family history. His boots made soft sounds on the heart pine floors his grandfather had installed in 1924. On the wall, in a handsome oak frame, hung the original plat map of the Whitlock farm, hand-drawn in 1890. It was a piece of art, a family heirloom he looked at every day, its delicate ink lines a testament to the sweat and toil that had secured this land. He stared at it now, not as a decoration, but as a piece of evidence. The property lines were clear, bold, and undisputed. Delilah followed him into the study, wiping her hands on her apron. She pulled their thick binder of HOA documents from a bookshelf. "I've read these covenants a dozen times since Morgana took over," she said, flipping through the pages. "She's been tightening the screws on every lawn height. Trash can placement, the color of your mailbox. But this is different." Her finger stopped on a page. She pushed the binder across the antique desk towards him. "Here," she said. "Section 8.4.2. Utility and landscape easements. This wording has always bothered me. It's so vague." Ezra read the highlighted paragraph. "A general utility, access, and landscape easement is hereby reserved to the association, its successors, and assigns, across such portions of the lots as are reasonably necessary for the common good and aesthetic uniformity of the community, the specific boundaries of which may be determined by the board of directors as needs arise." "Reasonably necessary," Ezra muttered, the legalese tasting like ash. "Determined by the board. That's not an easement. It's a blank check." He had mostly ignored Morgana Blackwood's reign over the Millbrook Falls Estates HOA, as the only working farm grandfathered into the development. He existed in a different world. He paid his dues, kept his property immaculate, and considered her endless stream of newsletters about pet etiquette and holiday decoration compliance to be the petty obsessions of a woman with too much time and not enough purpose. He saw her at community events, a perfectly coiffed woman in expensive shoes, her voice a perpetual, nasal critique of her surroundings. He had underestimated her, He saw that now. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about acquisition. His 16-year-old twins, Sage and Rowan, came downstairs, their sleepy weekend energy filling the room. Sage, pragmatic and sharp, immediately sensed the tension. Rowan, whose connection to the farm was almost mystical, just looked out the window toward the line of pink ribbons. "What are those flags for?" Dad Rowan asked, her voice small. Ezra looked from his daughter's worried face to the plat map on the wall, and then to the insidious legalese in the binder. His life was a balancing act between two worlds, the high-stakes, abstract world of federal policy in Washington, and the tangible, deeply personal world of this farm. He had always believed he could keep them separate, that his service in one sphere wouldn't threaten the other. But the pink ribbons in his field told a different story. Morgana Blackwood had just drawn a new line, and it ran straight through the heart of his home. The weekend passed in a state of suspended animation. The stakes remained. Ezra sent a polite but firm email to Pinnacle Management Group and to the general HOA board address, stating his objection, referencing his deed, and demanding the immediate removal of the survey markers from his private property. He received only an automated reply, confirming receipt of his message. The silence that followed felt tactical. On Monday, he flew back to D.C. The image of the pink ribbons burned into his mind. He spent the week chairing meetings, negotiating with senators, and trying to focus on the nation's crumbling infrastructure while his own foundation felt like it was being chipped away. One survey stake at a time. Delilah's texts were updates of unsettling calm, no new activity, no response from the board. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of holding one's breath. He knew Morgana was waiting for him to be 1,500 miles away, distracted by the demands of his office, to make her next move. He had seen this strategy before in the halls of Congress, the quiet procedural maneuver that precedes the devastating political blow. All politics, he reflected grimly, is local, and his was about to get very local indeed. The letter arrived the following Monday. It wasn't a simple envelope in the mailbox. It was delivered via certified mail, a deliberate, formal escalation that required a signature and carried the weight of legal significance. Delilah sent him a photo of the green card from the post office. USPS tracking, you are 9407 8036 9930 03999 8123 455. The number looked like a serial code for a weapon. That evening, over a secure video call, she held the letter up to the camera for him to read. The Pinnacle Management Group letterhead was crisp, the language impeccably polite and utterly menacing. Date May 1, 2024. Subject, courtesy notice of covenant violation property, 1420, Old Mill Road. Dear Mr. Whitlock, this letter serves as a courtesy notice regarding a maintenance issue on Association Common Area, adjacent to your property. An inspection has identified overgrown vegetation and a deceased oak tree within the 20-foot utility and landscape easement, as defined under CC&R Paragraph 8.4.2. Per the community's aesthetic rules, this area must be cleared to maintain the visual standards of Millbrook Falls Estates. We have scheduled a contractor to clear this vegetation on May 20th to ensure compliance. No action is required on your part. We appreciate your cooperation in keeping our community beautiful. Sincerely, David Chen, Community Manager, Pinnacle Management Group. Ezra read it 3 times. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive warfare. They weren't accusing him of a violation. They were informing him of their intent to perform maintenance on what they now officially, in writing, designated as a common area. The dead oak tree they mentioned was one of his grandfather's sentinels, a magnificent, century-old giant, that had succumbed to blight last winter. He'd planned to have it professionally milled into lumber for the farmhouse, a way to preserve its legacy. To them, it was just overgrown vegetation. The letter was a clear pretext. The casual mention of no action is required on your part was the most insulting line of all. They were telling him they were going to enter his land, cut down his family's history, and that he had no say in the matter. The stakes were no longer just wooden markers in a field. They were formal. They were documented. The invasion had been codified. "This is it," he said to Delilah's image on the screen. "This is the inciting incident." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and anxiety. "I'm sending a formal response tomorrow morning via my attorney, referencing my property survey and deed, and stating for the record that any entry onto our land will be considered trespassing. We fight this with documentation." He knew, even as he said it, that it wouldn't be enough. Morgana wasn't interested in a debate over documents. She was making a power play, and this was just the opening move. The courtesy notice wasn't courteous at all. It was a declaration. The response from his attorney, a sharply worded letter sent via courier with return receipt, was met with a chilling silence that lasted exactly 2 weeks. Then, the next piece of certified mail arrived. Date May 15, 2024. Subject formal notice of violation and demand to cure property. 1420 Old Mill Road. Dear Mr. Whitlock, this letter is to formally notify you that your property is in violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, of the Millbrook Falls Estates Homeowners Association. Specifically, you are in violation of Warger 8.4.2, Utility and Landscape Easements. Failure to maintain common area easement, free of debris and overgrown vegetation. Warger 9.1.5, Aesthetic Standards. Maintaining a dead tree visible from common areas, which negatively impacts community aesthetics. A photograph of the violation is enclosed. You have 14 days from the date of this letter to cure the defect by clearing the aforementioned vegetation and removing the dead tree at your own expense. Failure to comply by May 29, 2024, will result in further enforcement action by the Board of Directors, including the issuance of fines and a formal hearing. The enclosed photo was a grainy, zoomed-in shot of the dead oak, taken from the street. It looked less like evidence and more like a surveillance photo. They had twisted his refusal to acknowledge their false claim into a failure to maintain it. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver weaponize the process, create a violation where none exists, and force the opponent onto the defensive. "They're summoning us to a hearing," Delilah said, her voice heavy. When they spoke that night, the notice had arrived, summoning Ezra to an executive session of the Board of Directors on June 1st. "I'll be there," Ezra said, a cold resolve hardening in his chest. "I'm flying back. She wants a fight. She'll get one. But we're going to do this my way. On the record." The hearing was a masterclass in procedural theater. It took place not in the airy community clubhouse, but in a cramped windowless office at the Pinnacle Management Building. The air was stale with the smell of old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Ezra arrived punctually at 7:00 p.m., armed with a leather briefcase containing his certified property survey, the original county deed, and a large-scale printout of the official plat map. The room was set up like a courtroom, with Morgana Blackwood presiding from the center of a long table, a queen holding court. She was flanked by David Chen, the perpetually nervous community manager, and a sleek, sharp-suited man introduced as Vernon Hayes, the HOA's legal counsel. Ezra noted the same last name as Morgana's maiden name, her nephew. He recalled Delilah mentioning the other two board members, a retired accountant and a meek-looking woman who refused to make eye contact, sat at the ends of the table like bookends. Morgana opened the proceedings with a voice dripping with feigned regret. Ezra, we're so sorry it has come to this. We value you as a neighbor, but the covenants apply to everyone equally. Morgana, let's dispense with the pleasantries, Ezra said, his voice calm and firm. He opened his briefcase and laid the documents on the small table provided for him. This is not a matter of covenant enforcement. It's a matter of property boundaries. The area you refer to as a common area easement is, and has been for over a century, part of the Whitlock farm. This is my certified survey. He pushed the rolled document across the table. Vernon Hayes placed a hand on it, stopping it before it reached the center. Mr. Whitlock, the board is not here to dispute a survey. We are here to address a documented violation of the CC&Rs. How can it be a violation if it's on my private land? Ezra pressed, keeping his eyes on Morgana. The board, exercising its authority under Section 8.4.2, has determined that this 20-foot strip is reasonably necessary for community access and uniformity, Morgana said, her voice smooth as polished stone. She didn't even glance at his documents. The issue at hand is your failure to maintain it. So you're creating an easement with no legal basis, declaring it common area, and then fining me for not maintaining land you have no right to. The board has made its determination. Vernon interjected, his voice sharp. Do you have anything to add regarding the violation itself? The overgrown vegetation and the dead tree? Ezra felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind he felt when a senator was trying to trap him in a lie during a hearing. He recognized the strategy: narrow the frame, refuse to engage with the core issue, and stick to the manufactured talking points. It was a kangaroo court. The overgrown vegetation is a natural buffer required for my farm's organic certification, he explained patiently. And the tree is a piece of my family's heritage that I intend to have milled. Your board's determination threatens my livelihood and trespasses on my property rights. He gestured again to the survey. This document, filed with the county, supersedes any vague clause in your governing documents. Morgana smiled, a tight, unpleasant expression. We appreciate your perspective. Ezra, the board will now vote on the matter of the violation. She didn't consult the other members. She simply looked at them. The accountant mumbled aye, and the meek woman nodded silently. The motion carries. Morgana announced, a fine of $100 is hereby levied. A notice will be sent. This hearing is adjourned. It was over in less than 10 minutes. Ezra stood there, his meticulously prepared evidence untouched on the table. They had refused to even look at it. He had been completely and utterly railroaded. As he packed his briefcase, the cold rage inside him solidified into something harder, something more patient. He had approached this as a reasonable man trying to correct a mistake. He saw now that it wasn't a mistake. It was an attack. He walked out of the stuffy office and into the cool night air. He looked back at the building, a bland, anonymous box in a suburban office park. This was the sterile environment where they were trying to dismantle his family's legacy. He had lost the first battle, but Morgana had just shown him her strategy, and in doing so, she had given him the blueprint for how to defeat her. The war had just begun, and it would be fought not with emotion, but with a relentless, procedural coldness she would come to regret. The formal notice of the $100 fine arrived, as promised. It was followed 30 days later by a second notice, informing him the fine had doubled to $200 for continued non-compliance. The letters, with their crisp letterhead and officious language were like paper-cut assaults. But Ezra knew this was just the beginning of the procedural war. It was time to escalate his own tactics. "She's trying to bleed us with 1,000 cuts," he told Delilah over the phone. "We need someone who knows how to navigate the local system, someone who can't be intimidated." The answer wasn't a high-priced law firm from the city. The answer was sitting on a porch 2 houses down from the farm. A man who had been watching the slow creep of Millbrook Falls Estates for 50 years. Cornelius Murphy was 82 years old, a retired county records clerk, with hands gnarled by arthritis and a mind as sharp as a surveyor's tack. He had spent his entire professional life in the dusty, labyrinthine archives of the county courthouse. He knew where every deed was filed, every zoning variance was recorded, and, most importantly, where all the bureaucratic bodies were buried. Ezra found him tending his prize-winning roses, his movements slow but deliberate. "Cornelius, I need your help." Cornelius straightened up, wiping his hands on a worn denim shirt. A sly grin spread across his weathered face. "I was wondering when you'd come asking. Saw the stakes. Knew Blackwood was up to something rotten." They sat in Cornelius's kitchen, the air filled with the comforting smell of old wood and brewing tea. Ezra laid out the entire sequence of events, from the surveyor to the sham hearing. Cornelius listened intently, nodding, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. When Ezra finished, the old man tapped a crooked finger on the HOA's violation notice. "This here," he said, "is a classic land grab disguised as a landscaping dispute. They're building a case, a paper trail. They'll let the fines accumulate, file a lien, and then, when the amount is high enough, they'll threaten to foreclose. It's slow, it's legal, and it's vicious." "What can we do?" Ezra asked. "We fight paper with paper," Cornelius said, his eyes gleaming. "You've got your deed and your survey. That's the foundation. But her power comes from the HOA's own records, so we go after them. I want to see every set of board meeting minutes for the past 2 years. Every budget report, every contract." Ezra's formal request for the documents, as was his right as a homeowner, was met with a predictably slow and obstructive response from Pinnacle management. It took 2 weeks and a threat of legal action from Ezra's lawyer to finally receive a thick manila envelope. They sat at Ezra's kitchen table, spreading the documents out. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. The minutes from the April board meeting were heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs were blacked out with thick marker. Cornelius peered at the pages through his bifocals. He let out a low whistle. "Well, that's not a redaction. It's a confession. Now we just need to find out what they're hiding." While Cornelius began his quiet investigation, using old friendships and forgotten back channels at the courthouse, Morgana escalated her campaign of harassment. It was no longer confined to certified letters. Small, brightly colored violation stickers began appearing on Ezra's property. One was slapped on his mailbox for having a non-standard mounting post, the same post that had been there for 50 years. Another appeared on the gate to his pasture, citing an unapproved agricultural barrier. Then, the nuisance complaints started. Phone calls to the county sheriff about the sound of his tractor at 7 a.m. during planting season. An official complaint to the health department about the odor from his cattle, located a quarter-mile from the nearest house. Each complaint had to be answered, investigated, and dismissed. A process that chipped away at Ezra's time and patience. He realized Morgana was encouraging her loyalists among the homeowners to become her eyes and ears. A network of suburban informants. The campaign was designed to isolate him, to paint him as the difficult, non-compliant farmer who was a threat to the neighborhood's pristine and orderly existence. He saw it in the averted gazes of neighbors he'd known for years. The way they'd suddenly find something interesting on their phones when he drove by. The third notice from the HOA arrived on July 15th. This one came from the law office of Vernon Hayes. The tone was no longer passive-aggressive. It was openly hostile. The accumulated fines, now at $700 plus late fees and legal costs, were detailed in an itemized list. The final paragraph was a declaration of war. Your failure to remit payment and cure the outstanding violations has left the association with no alternative. Be advised that this letter serves as a formal notice of intent to file lien against your property at 1420 Old Mill Road. If payment is not received in full within 30 days, a lien will be recorded with the county, encumbering your title. Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. A lien. It was a serious threat. A legal claim that could jeopardize his farm's financing, his lines of credit, everything. It was the bludgeon they had been preparing all along. She's going for the kill shot, he told Delilah that night, his voice grim. He was back in his sterile D.C. apartment, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. She thinks she has me trapped. But, just as the pressure reached its peak, Cornelius called. His voice was crackling with the excitement of a man who had just solved a puzzle he'd been working on his whole life. Ezra, my boy, you're not going to believe this, he said. I called in a favor with Betty down at the management company. She's been there 20 years, remembers everything. She was the one who typed up the original minutes from that April meeting, before Morgana and her nephew got their hands on them. There was a pause on the line. Ezra could hear the rustle of paper. Are you sitting down? Cornelius asked. I am now. The redactions weren't about your farm, not directly. They were hiding a vote, a pre-authorization. The board voted to enter into a partnership with a developer, a company called the Oak Ridge Development Group. The deal is, the HOA provides road access through that 20-foot strip, and in return, the developer pays the HOA a service and access fee of $2 million. Ezra's mind raced, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. A new luxury development was planned for the old acreage behind his farm. The only viable, cost-effective way to connect it to the main road was through that strip of land. And guess who the sole proprietor of Oak Ridge Development Group is? Cornelius's voice was triumphant. A holding company registered in Delaware. But I did some digging. The holding company is owned by another company, which is owned by a family trust. The beneficiary of that trust, Morgana Blackwood. The phone felt heavy in Ezra's hand. This wasn't about a dead tree or community aesthetics. It wasn't even about power. It was about a multi-million-dollar kickback scheme. Morgana was planning to use the HOA's authority to seize a piece of his land, sell its access to her own secret company for a fortune, and leave the homeowners to foot the legal bills. It was brazen, criminal, and utterly diabolical. She's not just trying to put a lien on my farm, Ezra said, the words coming out in a low, dangerous whisper. She's trying to steal it to line her own pockets. That's the ticket, Cornelius confirmed. And the best part, Betty made a copy of the original, unredacted minutes before she filed them. She said she had a bad feeling. She's willing to sign an affidavit. Ezra leaned back in his chair, the sterile D.C. apartment fading away. He could see his farm, the fields, the ancient oaks. He now had the truth. He had the weapon he needed. But he knew Morgana was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. Her next move, he suspected, would not be a procedural one. It would be personal. Morgana's retaliation was swift and brutally effective. It came not in the form of another violation sticker or a certified letter, but as a quiet, Professional Inquiry from the Office of Governmental Ethics in Washington. Ezra was in a briefing with the President's Chief of Staff when his own aide discreetly handed him a note. He unfolded it to see 2 words: ethics complaint. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed over him. Later that day, in the sterile confines of his office, he read the full complaint. It was a work of fiction, artfully constructed by Vernon Hayes. Morgana claimed that Ezra was using the power and resources of his federal office to intimidate a private citizens association. She alleged he had made threats referencing his federal authority during the hearing, that he was improperly leveraging government contacts to harass the HOA board, and that his fight over a minor landscaping issue was a gross abuse of his position for personal gain. She had twisted his principled defense of his property into a narrative of corruption. The complaint triggered an automatic, non-negotiable internal review. While there was no immediate suspension, his work was now under a microscope. He was advised by White House counsel to cease all communication with the HOA and to let his personal attorney handle everything. He was effectively paralyzed, forced to fight a war on 2 fronts. One was a local battle for his family's land. The other was a high-stakes struggle for his career and reputation in the nation's capital. "She's trying to cut me off at the knees," Ezra told Delilah, his voice raw with a fury he was struggling to contain. He was pacing his D.C. apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy of indifferent stars. "I could call the Inspector General's office. I could launch a full federal investigation into her development company. I have the authority." "No." Delilah's voice came through the speaker, firm and grounding. "That's what she wants you to do. If you use your federal power now, you'll prove her right. You'll be the corrupt official using his office to settle a personal score. We have to win this here. Ezra, in Millbrook Falls, with our neighbors, not from Washington." She was right. He knew she was right. But the feeling of being hamstrung, of having his hands tied while his family's legacy was under attack, was maddening. He took a deep breath, forcing the rage down. Delilah's counsel was his anchor. Strategy, not force. The key, he realized, was to win over the community. Morgana's power was derived from the apathy and tacit consent of the homeowners. He needed to break that consent. His target became Arthur Vance, a well-respected architect who chaired the HOA's Architectural Control Committee (ACC). Arthur was a stickler for rules, a man who genuinely believed in maintaining community standards. He had initially, and publicly, sided with Morgana on the grounds of aesthetic uniformity. Ezra didn't approach him with accusations or anger. He invited Arthur and his wife over for dinner. He didn't mention the HOA at all during the meal. He and Delilah simply shared their story, the history of the farm, showing them the old family photographs and the framed plat map in the study. After dinner, over coffee on the porch, Ezra calmly laid out the documents: his survey, the county deed, and the 2 sets of minutes redacted and unredacted. He didn't ask for Arthur's support. He simply presented the facts. This was never about a dead tree. "Arthur," he said quietly, "it's about what's hidden behind these black bars." Arthur studied the unredacted minutes for a long time, his architect's eye for detail missing nothing. He looked up at Ezra, his expression one of dawning horror and disgust. "She's using the ACC's aesthetic guidelines as a cover for a land grab," he said, more to himself than to Ezra. "A multi-million-dollar land grab." "Yes," Ezra said, "and she's counting on good people like you to be so focused on the rules that you don't see the crime." Arthur Vance left that evening a changed man. He didn't make any promises, but Ezra saw the shift in his eyes. The first crack had appeared in Morgana's wall of authority. Meanwhile, The date of the HOA annual meeting was approaching. It was the one time all year that homeowners had an open forum. Ezra formally requested to be placed on the agenda. Pinnacle management responded that the agenda was full, but per the bylaws, he would be permitted to speak during the open homeowner session at the end of the meeting. Speakers, the email noted, would be strictly limited to 5 minutes. It was another procedural trap, designed to minimize his impact, but 5 minutes, Ezra knew, could be an eternity if you use them correctly. He and Cornelius began preparing, not for a speech, but for a presentation, a timed, sequential reveal of evidence. A week before the meeting, a new survey Ezra had commissioned for his legal defense revealed a small, unexpected complication. The survey, which was far more detailed than his original, showed that his elderly neighbor's property line was slightly off. Mrs. Gable, a sweet widow in her 80s, had a beloved rose garden whose prize-winning blooms encroached onto Ezra's land by a little over 2 feet. It was a minor, innocent mistake, decades old, that neither family had ever noticed. Cornelius brought him the news with a worried look. Morgana's nephew has been pulling property files at the courthouse all week. If he finds this, he'll use it. She'll paint you as a hypocrite at the meeting, demanding respect for your property lines while ignoring your neighbor's encroachment. Ezra looked at the survey map, at the small, 2-foot sliver of land where Mrs. Gable's prize-winning roses grew. An idea began to form, a way to turn Morgana's final, desperate tactic into the very thing that would seal her fate. It was a moral test, and he intended to pass it in the most public way possible. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to demonstrate the difference between a neighbor and a predator. The Millbrook Falls Estates Community Clubhouse buzzed with the low-grade tension of 100 simmering suburban grievances. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cheap perfume. 400 folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a dais where Morgana Blackwood and the board sat. A panel of self-important judges ready to preside over their fiefdom. To the side of the lectern, a large digital countdown timer had been placed, its red numerals glowing an ominous 5s URR. Ezra sat in the third row between Delilah and Cornelius, his briefcase resting on his lap. He felt a calm, cold clarity descend over him. He had spent the last week rehearsing his 5 minutes, timing every gesture, every slide change, every word. The meeting droned on with tedious reports from the landscaping committee and a heated debate over pickleball court hours. Finally, Morgana announced the open forum. Each speaker will have 5 minutes, she said, her eyes sweeping the room before landing, for a brief moment, on Ezra. The timer is absolute. Ezra walked to the lectern. He placed his laptop on the podium and connected it to the projector. As he did, the timer operator, a volunteer from the board, started the clock. 4:59. 4:58. Ezra ignored it. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, some friendly, some hostile, most just weary and indifferent. "Good evening," he began, his voice even and strong. "My name is Ezra Whitlock. My family has farmed the land next to this community for 134 years. Recently, a dispute has arisen over a 20-foot strip of that land. The board has declared it a common area easement. I'm here tonight to present the facts." Time 4:30. He clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen behind him. It was a high-resolution image of Section 8.4.2 of the CC&Rs. The board bases its claim on this clause, which grants the HOA the right to determine easements that are reasonably necessary for the common good. I acknowledge this language is vague, but vague language in a covenant does not grant the power to seize private property. Time 3:30. He clicked again. The screen now showed a split image. On the left was the official plat map from the county recorder's office. On the right was his own certified property survey. He used a laser pointer to trace the undisputed boundary line. Then, he overlaid a red box on the image, showing the 20-foot strip they were claiming. It was unequivocally, demonstrably inside his property line. These are not my opinions. These are legal, public records. They are the final word on property ownership in this county. They supersede any interpretation of the HOA's governing documents. A murmur went through the crowd. People were leaning forward, looking at the screen. Time 2. Orzioro click. The next slide showed the redacted board minutes he had received. Thick black lines obscured key paragraphs. When I asked for the records related to this decision, this is what I was given. He let the image hang there for a moment. Then, he clicked again. The unredacted version appeared next to it. The black bars vanished, revealing the text underneath. He used the laser pointer to highlight the key phrases. Partnership with Oak Ridge Development Group. Access fee of $2,000 to be paid to the association. The murmur in the room grew louder. People were turning to each other, whispering. He could see Morgana stiffen at the dais, her knuckles white where she gripped the table. Time 1. Bonjour click. The final piece of evidence appeared. An email chain. Through a public records request of the developer's zoning application, we obtained communication between the board and Oak Ridge Development. We also discovered that Oak Ridge is a shell company, its sole beneficiary. He advanced to the next slide, which showed the corporate filing document from the state of Delaware. Is a family trust belonging to our board president, Morgana Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the room. The whispers turned to angry shouts. "Thief!" someone yelled from the back. "Resign!" shouted another. Morgana was on her feet, her face a mask of fury. "This is an outrageous slander. These documents they are out of context." Vernon Hayes was at her side, whispering frantically in her ear. But the room was already lost to her. The timer on the screen read 0:55. Ezra held up a hand for quiet. The room, remarkably, fell silent. Time 0:45. I have one final point to make, Ezra said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. This has been about property lines, about what is right. In preparing my legal defense, my surveyor found an error. It turns out my property line is not where I thought it was in one spot. He looked directly at Mrs. Gable, who was sitting in the front row, looking confused and frightened. Morgana saw the direction of his gaze, and a cruel, triumphant smirk flickered across her lips. This was the trap she had been waiting for. "Mrs. Gable," Ezra said, his voice warm and respectful. "It appears your beautiful rose garden, the one that wins awards every year, encroaches on my land by about 2 feet." The room held its breath. Morgana leaned forward, ready for the kill. "So," Ezra continued, turning his back on Morgana and speaking directly to his neighbors, "my first act as a neighbor committed to our real community, a community based on respect, not rules, is to offer you a formal, no-cost, permanent easement for your garden, to be filed with the county tomorrow, because your roses are more important to this community than any 20-foot strip of land is to me." The timer hit 0. For a beat, there was absolute silence. Then, Arthur Vance, the head of the ACC, stood up. "I second that," he called out. "And I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in this entire board." The room erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar of catharsis, of a community waking up. People were on their feet, shouting, demanding answers. The foundation of Morgana's power, built on procedure and intimidation, crumbled in 5 minutes of meticulously presented truth. The pandemonium in the clubhouse was swift and decisive. Homeowners surged toward the dais, their faces a mixture of fury and betrayal. David Chen, the community manager from Pinnacle, seeing the tidal wave of liability about to crash down on his company, grabbed the microphone. "On behalf of Pinnacle Management Group," he announced, his voice trembling, "we are resigning as the managing agent for this association, effective immediately. All records will be turned over to the association's legal counsel." He didn't specify which legal counsel, a deft move that severed his ties to the disgraced Vernon Hayes. He then gathered his papers and fled the room, a man abandoning a sinking ship. Arthur Vance, empowered by the crowd's support, formally made a motion. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Blackwood and the current board. I also move to freeze all HOA accounts pending a full, independent forensic audit." Hands shot up across the room. The vote was nearly unanimous. Morgana stood frozen, her face ashen. The perfectly controlled mask of the suburban tyrant had shattered, revealing the stunned, desperate woman beneath. Her authority, once absolute, had evaporated in the space of a single motion. The crowd parted as she walked, not to the exit, but straight towards Ezra, her eyes burning with a venomous hatred that was centuries deep. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice low and ragged, audible only to him and Delilah. "You have no idea what this was about. My father—" Her voice broke, and she seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of her. Her nephew, Vernon, gently took her arm and guided her out of the building, not as a lawyer and his client, but as a young man escorting a broken relative from the scene of a disaster. In the weeks that followed, the old guard was swept away. A transition committee, with Ezra and Arthur Vance as co-chairs, was formed to stabilize the community. The developer behind Oak Ridge formally withdrew their application with the county, citing unforeseen access complications. The threat to Ezra's farm was over. The forensic audit, however, was just beginning. It was a painstaking process of untangling years of doctored invoices, shell companies, and diverted funds. But as the auditors dug, they uncovered something deeper than financial fraud. They found a box of old correspondence from the 1970s, tucked away in a file marked Historical Inquiries. Cornelius Murphy brought the file to Ezra's kitchen table one crisp autumn afternoon. "I think you need to see this," he said, his voice somber. Inside were letters, written on faded letterhead, between Ezra's grandfather, Samuel Whitlock, and a man named Franklin Blackwood Morgana's father. Franklin had been a small-time developer with grand ambitions. He had a plan to build the area's first major commercial center, but his project hinged on securing one small, critical piece of land for road access, the same 20-foot strip along the edge of the Whitlock farm. Samuel Whitlock, a man as stubborn and rooted as the oaks he loved, had refused to sell. The letters showed his polite but unyielding rejection of Franklin's increasingly desperate offers. The final letter was from Franklin, dated 1978. It was a bitter, rambling screed, accusing Samuel of ruining him, of single-handedly destroying his one chance at success. According to the county records Cornelius had pulled, Franklin Blackwood's development company went bankrupt 6 months later. The man had lost everything and died a broken, resentful man. Ezra looked up from the letters, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. This was never just about a $2 million kickback. That was the means, not the motive. This was a 40-year-old grudge. It was a daughter's misguided, obsessive quest to reclaim her father's lost honor, to succeed where he had failed, and to punish the family she blamed for his downfall. He remembered the flicker of the wounded child he had seen in her eyes at the meeting. It wasn't just greed. It was a generational vendetta, a tragedy passed down from father to daughter, disguised as a zoning dispute. He walked out onto his porch, the old letters in his hand. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields. The line of ancient oaks stood dark and resolute against the vibrant sky. The pink survey ribbons were long gone, the grass beneath them already healing. He looked out at the land, his land, secure and whole. He had fought a battle of documents and deadlines, of procedure and principle, and he had won. But the victory felt different now, tinged with a strange, tragic weight. He had not merely defeated a corrupt HOA president. He had closed the final chapter of a sad and bitter family story that began long before he was born. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the promise of a peaceful night.